Go ahead and open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 2. Last week we started this series looking at the life of Moses, and we focused on Moses' birth. And in particular, we were focused on the faith of his father and mother and the Hebrew midwives that are mentioned in the text. And so this week we're going to continue, and we'll be in chapter 2, finishing chapter 2 this week, as we now look at Moses' search for himself. Now remember, we'd ended with Moses being delivered to Pharaoh's daughter. She had found him along the Nile River in the reeds, and eventually he would be an adopted son of Egypt. And we don't know all the details of what went on there, but our text this week goes forward in Moses' life, and he's 40 years old at this point when we get into what we're looking at here in chapter 2. So go ahead and let's look at chapter 2, and verse 11 is where we're starting in our text today. Chapter 2 and at verse 11. It says, "It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren." What I suggest to you that Moses is doing on this occasion is he is doing some soul searching. He has grown up with the knowledge of one culture, at least a little bit, and with the experience of another. And so from time to time we hear people talk about how they're going to find themselves, or they're looking for themselves, seeking themselves. And some will take a sabbatical, and some will go to foreign countries, and some will go on a mission, some will go find themselves a secluded place. For Moses in this chapter, as we enter into our study today, the first thing he does is he goes back to where he came from. And that is, he goes to those who are Hebrews. He knows that he is a Hebrew, and he goes to see them. In the first 10 verses of chapter 2, again, Moses' life was saved by Pharaoh's daughter, and he's returned to his mother, and she's to nurse the child and then deliver him over to Pharaoh's daughter when the time was right. We don't know what time that was. We don't know how much instruction he received from his father and mother before he eventually went to Pharaoh's household. You look at the commentators, and some of them will say that perhaps as young as the age of 2, he might have been delivered over to Pharaoh's daughter. There are others who would say that he could have been as old as 12 when he was delivered over to Pharaoh's daughter. The text simply doesn't tell us how old he was. But what we do know is that he knew he was a Hebrew. When it says in verse 11 that he was grown and he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, that tells us he knows that he is a Hebrew. He understands, though he grew up as an Egyptian, these are his people. It's important to teach children from an early age. And his parents took that responsibility very seriously. How much time did they have? If they knew that they had a limited amount of time, we don't know what the limitation was, but they knew there was a limited amount of time. And I wish that all parents approach teaching their children about God with that kind of perspective, that maybe I have a limited amount of time to tell my children about God and about his goodness. Parents need to prepare their children for the future, and it seems that Amram and Jochebed did so with Moses, because when he comes of age, when he has this realization that he is a Hebrew and goes to look at what is going on with his people. At whatever age he was turned over to Pharaoh's daughter, the teaching changed. He had been learning about the God of creation. He had been learning about the God of the Hebrews, been learning about the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the history of their people. And then the teaching changed. What we're told in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, is Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. The teaching of the Egyptians, he is not going to hear about Jehovah in the midst of all that. He will hear about a number of gods. They had gods for a bunch of different things, and when we get to the plagues, understand that the plagues are actually God striking out at the Egyptian gods. You can associate each of the plagues with one or more of the Egyptian gods, and so God's showing that he's superior to what they count as gods. But Egypt, at this time in history, was the epicenter for knowledge. They were the most advanced of all cultures at the time. And so some of the things that he was learning, would be simple things like arithmetic and geometry and music and poetry and medicine and hieroglyphics. He'd be learning about astrology and magic arts and religion, all kinds of things that he would be learning about. In fact, the wisdom of Egypt was so impressive that if we fast forward into the timeline of Israel's history and go to Solomon, so we're talking about the third king in Israel's history. In 1 Kings chapter 4 and at verse 30, it says, Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. The wisdom of Egypt was so impressive, so exceptional, that it warranted mention next to Solomon, who was granted wisdom from God himself. So I want you to consider the position that all this has placed Moses in. Instructed by his parents in the ways of the Hebrews, for a short time, he knows he is a Hebrew. He's heard about the God of the Hebrews. But did he have time to develop true faith in the Lord? Or were those mere stories from his parents? We understand everybody has that growing stage where it's not really their own faith yet. Children do not grow up on their own faith. They grow up on the faith of their parents. And then there's a transition time that will come where they start to develop their own faith. Where it's no longer they're following what mom and dad are saying, or they're following what uncle or aunt are saying, or grandpa or grandma are saying, but they develop their own faith. And again, we don't have enough information to tell us exactly where Moses was in that process, but I suspect that he was still operating on his parents' faith, on what he had heard from them, especially since the teaching that he's had for the past likely 30 years, or perhaps more, has had nothing to do with the Hebrews. But he still knows about that God. It's still there in his mind. Adopted into the royal family, it afforded him all the comforts that you could have as a royal. He's trained in the wisdom of Egypt. And part of all this teaching and training would be that our gods are superior to all other gods. Why wouldn't they be? Because we're the greatest nation in the world, and we've got other nations who are actually subject to us, they're slaves to us. And so as he goes out to check on his people, on the Hebrews, he's in a difficult position. You ever have it happen where you just don't know which way to go? You're being pulled in two different directions, and you really don't know. That is where Moses is at this point. Do you know how easy it would have been to forsake his heritage? He was comfortable. It would have been convenient to live as an Egyptian. Think about the life of a Hebrew slave versus the life of a royal in the palace of Egypt. It would have been convenient to live as an Egyptian. In fact, some commentators even suggest that he may have been in line for the throne. We read about Pharaoh's daughter. We don't read about Pharaoh's son. And the historical record doesn't indicate there was a son to this Pharaoh either. Pharaoh's daughter seeks to adopt a child. Yes, she may have been moved by compassion, but if she has no children of her own, this may have been the continuation of a lineage. How many people faced with the same situation would choose to leave the palace of Egypt, even to go see? And that speaks well of Moses that he did. We don't have the details. Was he curious? Is that why he went out? Was it that somebody had reminded him of his Hebrew heritage, trying to demean him, and that got him to thinking that he wanted to go and check on them? Whatever it was, Moses felt the need to go and check on his brethren. In Acts 7 at verse 23, we've got 22 on the board where it talks about his learning. Verse 23 says, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. Again, we don't know why that came into his heart. But out he goes to visit with the children of Israel. Back in Exodus 2, verse 11 and 12, when Moses was grown, he he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. While he is checking out the burden of his people, he sees an atrocity within the atrocity. Not only is it bad enough that they are burdened as they are, and remember we saw in chapter 1 that they placed heavy burdens on them. It's not just a daily job. They have a heavy burden being laid upon them. But then we have this scenario where somebody is being beaten. An Egyptian is beating a Hebrew. Again, we don't have all the details of why. We don't know what exactly is going on. The common assumption is that the Egyptian is one of the taskmasters and that the Hebrew perhaps is a slave who's moving slower than expected. Again, that's the common assumption. These could have just simply been any Egyptian and any Hebrew disputing over anything, and the Egyptian felt comfortable enough with their superiority to go ahead and beat up on the Hebrew. Was Moses' first reaction to rise up and kill the Egyptian? Perhaps not. Again, we don't have all the details of what went on. Most people will try to diffuse the situation, try to calm things down. But in Acts chapter 7 and verse 24, it says, seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. He stood up to defend one of the Hebrews. In the process of that, the Egyptian is struck down, the Egyptian is killed. This, again, had to be a difficult situation for Moses. We don't know, has he been shielded from knowing about the treatment of the Hebrews? I don't think he goes for daily strolls out among the slaves to find out what's going on. And so maybe this is his first introduction to what is going on with his people. But having seen it, he cannot just let it happen. He strikes down the Egyptian. Verse 25 tells us, for he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. That is an interesting verse. Why was he out there, and why did he stand up for this Hebrew, and why would he kill the Egyptian? This verse identifies this as being the point at which Moses perceived his position in life, why he was there. Before having seen the oppression, it was just simply, well, the Hebrews are out there somewhere doing something. Now he sees it and he understands, I'm here to free these people. That's an important thing when we finally realize why we're here. When we realize what our purpose is. And that's what Moses is understanding now. My purpose is to release the people of Israel, the Hebrews. You and I may have some purpose that is specific in its nature, but our generic purpose is to fear God and keep His commandments. So Solomon told us, Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Moses understood his purpose, but notice the last clause, but they did not understand. The Hebrews didn't quite see him as a deliverer. We're never really told at this point how they perceive Moses, if they think he is a traitor of sorts, if they think that do they even know his Hebrew origin? Some of them may not know. The next day, Moses sees two Hebrews fighting. Exodus 2 verse 13 tells us about it. Acts 7 verse 26 tells us about it. It doesn't say what they're fighting about, but the text does reveal that it's not just a verbal spat. It's not just that they're arguing with one another. In fact, it tells us that one of them struck the other. And so Moses intervenes. He seeks to reconcile these people, to bring them back together, and he is not well received. In Acts 7 at verse 27, it says that the one who did his neighbor wrong and pushed Moses away, and then here's what he said to Moses: who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Remember, Moses looked this way and that way, and he saw nobody before rising up and killing the Egyptian on the previous day. He thought that it had been done in secret. He was wrong. This man saw him, and who knows who else may have seen him. And even if they didn't see him, if this man saw him, then I'm sure that he told somebody else, who told somebody else, who told somebody else. And so the thing is known. We're going to talk about lessons in the text when we get to the end, but let me stop here and say there's a lesson in that for us. Even when we think we might be doing something in secret, someone's going to find out. And even if no one on earth sees us, understand that God always sees what we do. He knows the things that we do in secret, whether they be good or evil. There's nothing that is done that is not known, at least by the Lord in heaven. Verse 15, Exodus 2 and at verse 15. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. Understand, Moses is his adopted grandchild. But he heard what happened, and obviously Moses has turned back to the Hebrews. He's defending a Hebrew, and so Pharaoh seeks to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Moses skipped town very fast. After he knew that it was known that he had killed the Egyptian, Acts chapter 7 tells us that he was very afraid, and so he leaves. Remember the notion that he had, the thought that had crossed his mind, that we had recorded from Acts chapter 7, he understood he was there to deliver the Hebrews. That was his purpose. That was what he was called to do. What he does at this point is he very quickly sets that notion aside. Apparently, I'm not here to deliver the Hebrews. And so he leaves town. The Hebrew people don't believe he's there to deliver him, or to deliver them. They don't look at him as being a deliverer. He is an Egyptian, if not by biology, then at least by his lifestyle. And the man that we just encountered said, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over me?" We have a statement from one man, but let me suggest to you that he's not the only one who would say that. And we know that from when Moses returns 40 years later. And so he gives up on the idea that he's there to deliver them. It was a fleeting thought, I guess. A momentary suggestion from the circumstance, but no, that can't be. And so he flees. When Pharaoh wants to kill you, it's time to skip town. Pharaoh likely felt betrayed. I accept this Hebrew into the royal family, and he does this. And so he seeks to kill him. Now, I mentioned last week that there are a number of different pharaohs in the Bible narrative. And again, I think it's important for us to keep that in mind, that there's a bunch of them. And so remember, it was Apophis who elevated Joseph. And then there are two additional pharaohs after Apophis who know Joseph, Ames and Amenhotep I. Thutmose I is the pharaoh who didn't know Joseph and enslaved the Hebrews. Thutmose II is the pharaoh who decreed that all male babies born to the Hebrews be slaughtered. We didn't talk about this last week, but by the way, he only reigned for 3 years. Had a very short reign. He was replaced by Hatshepsut. She is not a pharaoh. She's a queen of Egypt. And she reigned for 22 years. She is Thutmose I's daughter. So Moses' Egyptian mother's aunt. Follow that? Moses' Egyptian mother's aunt. The pharaoh that Moses is running from here is Thutmose III. He is the one who wants to kill Moses for having killed the Egyptian. And again, I believe that it's important for us to understand we've got several people in play when we're reading the Genesis and Exodus narrative. In fact, there will be one more. Amenhotep II is the one who reigns when Moses returns to Egypt. So the people don't believe. Pharaoh wants to kill him, and so off to Midian he goes. It's time to leave. Understand, this was not Moses retreating just for a short time. You know, we need to maybe change the course of action, change the strategy. Still going to release the Hebrew people, but we have to plan this out. That is not what's happening. He has given up on that idea. He is not the deliverer of the people of Israel. He leaves and he goes to Midian, and he stays there for 40 years. He goes there and he has a life for himself in Midian. Because Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. Acts 7, verse 29. It's not that Moses fled and regrouped in the land of Midian so that he could go back and release the Hebrew people. That is not what is on his mind. He became a dweller. This was now home. In Exodus 2, verse 16 and 17, it talks about him helping the daughters of Reuel, who is also known as Jethro. shepherds came and tried to drive them away from the watering hole, and Moses helped them. Eventually, he's invited to come and stay in the household of Jethro, and he marries the man's daughter, Zipporah. He became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. He settled in. Now, you've heard me talk about the importance of Bible names in the past. There's meaning to the names that are in the Bible. And that's the case here with Moses' sons as well. The name of the first son reveals something about the turmoil that's going on in Moses' heart. The son's name is Gershom. It means a stranger there, expelled or exiled. Exodus 2, verse 22, Moses says, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. He felt out of place in Egypt. He didn't belong in the house of Pharaoh. He understood that. Otherwise, it wouldn't have entered his heart to go and see what was going on with the Hebrews. And yet, apparently, he also didn't belong with the people of Israel. He was an outsider to them, and they wanted nothing to do with him. And so he was a stranger in a foreign land and among his own people. And that's conveyed in the naming of his first son. His second son, he named him Eliezer. God is his help. That's what his name means. In Exodus 18, verse 4, as he names the son, it says, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. It was about his flee. He got out of there by the grace of God. But understand, in the naming of his sons, Moses is sort of setting his roots where he is. Midian is a good place. He has a wife. He has children. He doesn't feel like a stranger. He doesn't feel like an outcast. God has given him safety and brought him there. So he's made a life for himself in Midian. He even got a job. He's a shepherd. It's a lot easier than being the deliverer of a nation. You see, the confusion and the mess of Egypt are now all behind him, right? He sort of hit the big reset button in his life, and he's in comfort and enjoying life, and he doesn't have to think about the Hebrews. He doesn't have to think about the Egyptians and all that's going on with them. There was no acceptance back there anyways. But now he fits in. This whole scenario in some ways reminds me of Joseph. Joseph, hated by his brothers and sold as a slave. As a slave, he was wrongfully accused and imprisoned. Then he's forgotten by the butler when he gave the butler the interpretation of his dream, and he was risen back to power. And eventually, Joseph finds success and peace. He's risen to power. He finds respect. And again, you see it in the naming of his children. Remember the names of Joseph's children? Manasseh. God has made me forget the mistreatment that my brothers gave me, the being sold into slavery, the lies that were told about me, my time in prison. God has made me forget. And then he names the second son Ephraim. God has made me fruitful in the land of affliction. Despite the fact that there was a famine ongoing, God had blessed him. And I'm sure Joseph would have loved for things to just continue on as they were. And he's comfortable, he's respected, he's at peace. And then who walks through the door? His brothers. And his life gets shaken once more with their arrival. Moses is very much the same. He thinks that he's where he's supposed to be. And he thinks that everything is right in the world. But a big change is on its way. To close out the text in Exodus 2, verse 23, the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groanings, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. And you know what happens in chapter 3. We're going there next week. God is going to send Moses back to Egypt, where he felt like a stranger in a foreign land and an unwanted person, either by Hebrew or Egyptian. God is going to send him back. His life is going to be shaken once more. Let me suggest some lessons for you out of our text. First one, it's quite simply this. Moses went out to look at their burdens. He didn't experience it. He didn't know what they were going through. And so it came into his heart to go and to look and to find out what they were going through. Again, we really don't know how much he knew about their lives. He grew up as an Egyptian. But knowing he was a Hebrew, he went out and looked at their burdens. That reminds me about what Jesus did for us. He came to where we are. Take a look at a couple of verses with me. Romans chapter 8 and at verse 3. Understand, Jesus did not just stay up in heaven and look down at us. He actually came to where we are. Romans 8 and at verse 3. For what the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. On account of sin, he condemned sin in the flesh. He didn't just stay in heaven. He came to where we are, and he took upon flesh as we have it. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 and 15. Hebrews 2, verse 14 and 15. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. How is he ever going to release us from the bondage of death? He had to come and be with us. He had to come and meet us where we are in the flesh, and he in fact died for us. Of course, death could not hold him because he had no sin, and therefore he could defeat death. But he came to release us from bondage. Moses didn't even know what their bondage was completely about until he went and saw it. He had to go and see it. Jesus came and saw the bondage that we were in so that he could release us from it. In Luke chapter 10, I'll just reference this one, we'll not turn to it, but Luke 10, we have the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember, there was the priest and the scribe, and they both passed by on the other side. They actually crossed the road to get away from the man who had fallen among the thieves. And then the Samaritan comes along, and what we're told is the Samaritan had compassion on him and went to him where he was, and he tended to his wounds, put him on his beast, and took him with him to the next city. That's what Jesus did for you and I. He came to where we are. Jesus came and spent time with sinners. He didn't partake of their sin, but he came and spent time with sinners. Jesus touched lepers. Jesus healed those who were broken. Jesus came to deliver. Moses had to go where they were. He had to see what they were going through. Now let me bring this down to you and I. If we are going to affect people in this world with the gospel, then we need to go to them where they are. We can't just sit here and wait for people to come through the door. Sometimes that will happen. Rarely that will happen. What we need to do is we need to go where people are. We need to go to them in their bondage, whatever their bondage be, so that we can learn how to help get them out of it, learn what they need to be brought away from. I'm not saying we need to engage in their sin, but we can't expect that the world is somehow going to be whitewashed so that we can walk around and feel okay. We need to meet people where they are, and they are in sin, and we need to lead them away from that. We need to go to people where they are and look at their burdens and meet their bondage so that we can help them be free. Moses struggled in trying to figure out where he fit in. Am I an Egyptian? Am I a Hebrew? Am I a deliverer? Am I a shepherd? He had a big struggle to find out where he fit in. And I think all of us go through struggles of that nature to some degree or another. Like, where do I fit into the whole plan? You know, some of us had some misfit years in high school where we just didn't quite fit in, or maybe at work we're an outcast, or some other kind of awkward situation in our life. We all have this kind of struggle where we're not sure how we fit in. The royal family was not a good fit for him. The people of Israel, the Hebrews at that time, were not a good fit for him. He struggled with that. Well, we sometimes have the same thing. Understand, the Egyptians are representative of the world and the ways of the world. And we shouldn't fit in there. We should feel uncomfortable that there's a problem if we're trying to fit in with the world. Moses could not fit in Egypt. He was not a royal of Egypt. But then when he goes to his own people, he has troubles there as well. There may be times when we have a struggle to fit in among God's people, where maybe there's things about us that we're embarrassed about, or there's things about us where we need to grow, or maybe there's need for growth on the other side among God's people as well, among the members of the church. But I think we all have those kinds of struggles where I'm not quite sure how I fit in. What we need to not do is walk away from the situation. Walk away from the world, absolutely, but from among God's people, we need to figure out where we fit in. Moses went to Midian for 40 years. He left God's people for 40 years. Guess what God's going to do when he comes to Moses in Midian? Moses, you need to go back there. You need to be with God's people. We need to be with God's people. We need to find where we fit in, what our place is. 1 Corinthians 12, Paul talks about the church, and he uses the image of a body to describe it. And one of the things that he mentions in the text is that every part has a role. Every part of the body has a role, and my feet don't do for me what my hands do. And my ears don't do for me what my eyes do. But I need my feet and my hands and my ears and my eyes. I need every part of my body. And the same is true of the body of Christ. We may not all get up and lead songs. We may not all lead a prayer. We may not all do the preaching. We may not all, whatever it be. But we have a place, we have a part, we have a role. And we need to fulfill that. So we need to figure out where we fit in. And then the last thing, just don't get too comfortable. Moses, as we leave him at the end of chapter 2, is comfortable. He's off in Midian. He's found himself a wife. He's had children. He's got a good job. Everything is going great in his life. Troubles of Egypt, they're long past, right? 40 years ago for all that kind of stuff. And then God is going to call him back. We need to be willing to stretch beyond our comfort zones. Lord willing, next week when we talk about God calling him, we're going to see that Moses started to make excuses. He tried to find a way around what God wanted him to do. Friends, we need to not make excuses. We need to stretch beyond our comfort zones. We need to be willing to go and talk with people about the gospel, invite people to study. We need to grow in our relationship with one another, grow in our faith. We need to be stretching. Don't get comfortable. Comfortable and complacency often go together. And the end result when we put those two together is not growth. We actually regress. And so we need to always be ready to present ourselves as servants for the Lord, for his cause, wanting to further his cause in this world and serve him as we can.